In the autumn of 1829, in Louisa County, Virginia, something happened that made the entire state question whether slavery could be controlled. A man named Edmund, 3 masters dead in ways that made experienced lawmen refuse to describe what they'd seen, and a pattern of violence so calculated that it revealed something terrifying. Some enslaved people had been studying their masters' vulnerabilities for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. If stories about the breaking point matter to you, about what happens when oppression pushes someone past every human limit, then stay with me. Because what Edmund did between 1826 and 1829 tells you everything you need to know about rage that's been building for decades, and why the men who owned him never saw it coming until it was far too late. The year 1826 sits in a strange period of American slavery. The international slave trade had been banned for almost 20 years, but the domestic trade was booming. Virginia had become a breeding ground, literally, for enslaved people who would be sold south to the expanding cotton frontier. Families were being systematically destroyed for profit, and everyone knew it, and the system kept grinding forward anyway. Edmund was born around 1795 on a tobacco plantation in Louisa County. By 1826, he was 31 years old and had already been owned by 3 different masters. He'd watched his mother sold when he was 7. His sister sold when he was 12. His wife, a woman named Rachel he'd married in the loose, unofficial way enslaved people married, sold away when he was 23, 8 months pregnant with his child. Edmund had spent 31 years watching people he loved disappear, 31 years being treated as property, 31 years accumulating rage that had nowhere to go because expressing it meant death. But Edmund had certain skills that made him valuable and gave him opportunities other enslaved people didn't have. He was a butcher, trained in processing livestock, skilled with knives, knowledgeable about anatomy. He worked in the plantation slaughterhouse, turning animals into meat that would feed the plantation and be sold for profit. Edmund understood bodies, understood how to break them down efficiently, understood where to cut to cause the most damage, how to bleed an animal properly, how to separate meat from bone with precision. Those skills made him valuable. They also made him dangerous, though nobody recognized the danger until far too late. By 1826, Edmund had developed a reputation as the best butcher in Louisa County. When plantation owners needed an animal processed, they'd request Edmund. When wealthy families wanted fresh meat for special occasions, they'd ask to borrow Edmund's services. He was in demand, which meant he moved between plantations more than most enslaved people did. This mobility gave Edmund something unusual: information. He saw how different masters operated, understood their routines, their vulnerabilities, their habits. He learned which masters were careless about security, which ones drank heavily, which ones were cruel enough to make enemies of everyone around them. Edmund watched and learned and remembered everything. And slowly, over years, something changed inside him. The rage that had been simmering since childhood began to crystallize into something more focused, something with purpose. He didn't just want to hurt the system. He wanted to hurt specific people, the masters who'd owned him, who'd sold away everyone he loved, who treated him as property despite knowing he was intelligent, skilled, capable of sophisticated work. Edmund began to plan. Not immediately. He was too smart for that. But he started observing more carefully, started noting details that might be useful, started thinking about what was possible if you understood anatomy and had access to the tools of your trade. Edmund's first master in our story was William Preston. Preston owned the plantation where Edmund had been born and where he'd spent most of his life. Preston was 62 years old in 1826, wealthy, respected in the community, a deacon at the Baptist church. Preston was also the man who'd sold Edmund's mother when Edmund was 7, explaining to a crying child that it was just business, nothing personal, that Edmund would understand when he was older. Edmund understood perfectly. He'd understood for 24 years, and he'd been waiting for the right opportunity. Preston's vulnerability was his routine. Every Tuesday evening, Preston would walk to the slaughterhouse to check on the next day's work. He'd inspect the animals scheduled for processing, make notes about what cuts he wanted, discuss business with Edmund. These visits happened after the other workers had left for the evening. Preston preferred it that way, liked having time to think and plan without interruption. It meant Preston and Edmund were alone in the slaughterhouse for 30 minutes to an hour each week. For years, these visits had been routine. Edmund would listen to Preston's instructions, nod respectfully, do exactly as he was told. Preston trusted him completely. Why wouldn't he? Edmund had been a faithful, obedient worker for decades. But in November 1826, Edmund decided that faithfulness and obedience had reached their end. Preston arrived at the slaughterhouse on a Tuesday evening, as usual. Edmund was there, as usual, preparing tools for the next day's work. They talked about the upcoming processing: 3 hogs, a cow, several chickens. Preston was examining one of the hogs, his back turned to Edmund, when Edmund picked up a cleaver and calculated the exact angle and force needed to incapacitate Preston with a single blow. Edmund had spent decades learning precision, learning where to strike to drop an animal instantly. The back of Preston's head was no different from an animal's, anatomically speaking. The same vulnerable points, the same catastrophic results from properly placed trauma. Edmund struck once. Preston dropped. What happened next was never fully described in court records, but the physician who examined Preston's body used words like methodical and surgical and extensive post-mortem injury. Edmund had used his butcher's skills to take Preston apart, the way he'd taken apart thousands of animals. It wasn't just violence. It was a message. Edmund was showing what he thought of men who treated people as livestock. He'd processed Preston like livestock, using the same tools and techniques. When Edmund was finished, he cleaned the slaughterhouse thoroughly, washed the tools, removed obvious evidence, arranged things to look like an accident. Then he went back to his cabin and slept soundly for the first time in years. Preston's body was discovered the next morning by an overseer who'd come to check why Preston hadn't returned home. The scene was so disturbing that several people who saw it became physically ill. The initial assumption was that Preston had been attacked by an animal. Perhaps one of the hogs had gotten loose and gored him. But the physician who examined the body quickly determined that the injuries were made by tools, not tusks. Someone had killed Preston deliberately, using knives and cleavers. The sheriff began investigating. He questioned everyone who'd been on the plantation that evening. Edmund was questioned like everyone else and expressed shock and horror that someone would kill Master Preston, who'd been so kind to him for so many years. Nobody suspected Edmund. Why would they? He'd been with Preston for decades, had always been obedient, reliable, trustworthy. The idea that Edmund could have done something so violent seemed impossible. The investigation eventually concluded that Preston had been killed by an escaped slave from another plantation, someone passing through who'd taken the opportunity to commit murder. No one was ever arrested, but the case was officially closed. Edmund went back to work, as if nothing had happened. But something fundamental had changed inside him. He'd killed the man who'd sold his mother, who'd owned him for most of his life, who represented everything Edmund hated about slavery. And he'd gotten away with it. The rage that had been building for 31 years had found an outlet. And Edmund discovered something about himself. He was good at this, good at planning, at executing, at covering his tracks, good at using the skills he'd learned as a butcher for a very different kind of processing. In early 1827, Edmund was sold to a new master. Preston's estate was being settled, and Edmund, as a valuable skilled worker, was one of the assets being liquidated. He was purchased by a man named Charles Thornton. Thornton owned a plantation about 15 miles from Preston's property. He'd bought Edmund specifically for his butchering skills, intending to improve the plantation's meat production, and potentially hire Edmund out to neighboring plantations for extra income. Edmund arrived at Thornton's plantation in March 1827. He went through the familiar process of learning new routines, meeting new people, understanding new vulnerabilities. Thornton was different from Preston in some ways. He was younger, 48 years old, and more physically active. He didn't have the same predictable routines Preston had followed. He was also more suspicious by nature, less trusting. But Thornton had his own vulnerabilities. He was proud of his livestock, particularly his horses. He spent hours in the stables, checking on the animals, talking to the stable hands, personally overseeing their care. The stables were separate from the main house, set back in a wooded area for smell and noise reasons. At night, Thornton would often visit the stables alone, checking on any animals that were sick or about to foal. Edmund worked in the slaughterhouse, which was near the stables. He was aware of Thornton's habits, noticed when Thornton made his evening visits, understood that these visits happened when Thornton was alone and distracted. For months, Edmund did nothing. He needed to establish himself as trustworthy, needed Thornton to see him as just another obedient worker. He needed patience. The incident that sealed Thornton's fate happened in August 1827. An enslaved boy named Thomas, maybe 14 years old, was caught stealing apples from Thornton's orchard. It was a minor offense. The boy was hungry. The apples would have fallen and rotted anyway. Thornton had Thomas whipped anyway. 20 lashes in the yard while everyone watched. The boy screamed and begged, and Thornton showed no mercy. Edmund watched Thomas's back being torn apart and made his decision. Thornton would pay the same price Preston had paid. Edmund began preparing carefully. He studied Thornton's stable visits, noting when they happened and how long they lasted. He identified which stable would provide the most privacy for what he planned to do. He prepared his tools, the knives and implements he used for butchering, cleaned and sharpened. In October 1827, on a night when Thornton was checking on a mare about to foal, Edmund made his move. Thornton was in the stable, focused on the horse, when Edmund entered behind him. Thornton turned, saw Edmund, started to say something, probably to ask why Edmund was there so late. Edmund didn't give him time to finish the question. The knife he'd brought, a boning knife, thin and sharp, entered just below Thornton's ribcage, angled upward toward the heart. Edmund knew exactly where to place it, exactly how deep to push, exactly how to cause fatal damage quickly and efficiently. Thornton dropped. Edmund caught him before he could fall loudly, lowered him to the stable floor. Then, working with the same methodical precision he'd used on Preston, Edmund used his butcher's skills to send another message about what he thought of men who owned other human beings. When Edmund was finished, he cleaned his tools, removed obvious evidence, and left the stable. He returned to the slaughterhouse, established that he'd been working late on processing a hog, made sure people saw him there, covered in animal blood. Thornton's body was discovered the next morning by a stable hand. Like Preston's death, the scene was so disturbing that witnesses struggled to describe it. The physician who examined the body noted the same methodical, surgical quality to the injuries. The sheriff investigated. The working theory was that Thornton had been attacked by someone from outside the plantation, perhaps an escaped slave or a criminal passing through. Edmund was questioned briefly, provided his alibi about working late in the slaughterhouse, and was quickly dismissed as a suspect. After all, Edmund was just a butcher, a valuable, skilled worker. Why would he risk his own life by killing his master? The idea seemed absurd. The case went unsolved. In December 1827, Edmund was sold again. Thornton's widow didn't want to run the plantation alone and was liquidating assets. Edmund was purchased by a man named Henry Mitchell. Mitchell was the worst of Edmund's masters. He was 55 years old, brutal in ways that Preston and Thornton hadn't been. Mitchell believed that enslaved people needed to be kept in constant fear to maintain control. He whipped people publicly for entertainment. He separated families casually, selling children away from mothers as punishment for minor infractions. Mitchell owned a large plantation near Gordonsville, Virginia. He had nearly 100 enslaved people and ran the operation like a military camp. Strict rules, harsh punishments, constant surveillance. Edmund arrived at Mitchell's plantation in January 1828 and immediately understood he was in a more dangerous situation. Mitchell was paranoid, suspicious, watched everyone constantly. The overseers were numerous and alert. Opportunities for private action would be rare. But Edmund had already killed 2 masters and hadn't been caught. He was confident in his abilities, patient in his planning. Mitchell would be more challenging, but not impossible. The incident that sealed Mitchell's fate happened in March 1828. Mitchell had an enslaved woman named Sarah who'd tried to run away. She was caught within a day. There was nowhere for enslaved people to run in rural Virginia. No network to help them. No realistic hope of reaching free territory. Mitchell had Sarah brought back and made an example of her. He had her whipped until she lost consciousness, then revived and whipped again. He did this in front of the entire plantation, making sure everyone understood what happened to people who tried to escape. Sarah survived, barely. Edmund helped care for her wounds afterward and listened to her broken sobbing, and something inside him solidified into pure, focused hatred. Mitchell would die. Not quickly, not mercifully. Mitchell would understand pain and fear before Edmund was finished with him. Edmund spent months studying Mitchell's habits. Mitchell was careful, but everyone has patterns. Everyone has moments of vulnerability. Edmund just needed to find Mitchell's. The opportunity came in November 1828. Mitchell was planning a trip to Richmond for business. He'd be gone for 3 days, leaving the plantation in his overseer's control. But before he left, he wanted to check on the plantation's meat stores, make sure there was enough processed and preserved to last while he was away. Mitchell came to the slaughterhouse the evening before his departure. It was late. Most workers had finished for the day. Mitchell wanted to review inventory with Edmund, discuss what needed to be processed while he was gone. They were alone in the slaughterhouse. Edmund and the man who'd tortured Sarah, who represented everything Edmund had spent 33 years hating. Mitchell was examining the preserved meat when Edmund struck. the same precision, the same anatomical knowledge, the same sudden, overwhelming violence that had worked twice before. But this time, Edmund didn't make it quick. Mitchell had done worse than Preston or Thornton. Mitchell had made people suffer for entertainment. So Edmund made sure Mitchell suffered. What happened over the next hours was never fully documented, but the physician who eventually examined Mitchell's body noted that the injuries suggested prolonged torture before death. Mitchell had been kept alive deliberately, while Edmund used his butcher's skills to cause maximum pain. When Edmund was finally satisfied that Mitchell understood what he'd done, understood the pain he'd caused others, Edmund finished it. Then he cleaned the slaughterhouse with the same thoroughness he'd shown after killing Preston and Thornton. Mitchell's body was discovered 2 days later, when his overseers came looking for him, worried that he'd never arrived in Richmond. The scene was the worst yet. Even hardened overseers were shaken by what they saw. The sheriff who investigated was the same one who'd handled the Preston and Thornton cases. He was beginning to notice a pattern. 3 plantation owners dead in slaughterhouses or stables. 3 deaths involving extensive post-mortem injury, using butcher's tools. 3 cases where the killer clearly had intimate knowledge of anatomy. The sheriff started asking different questions. Who had access to all 3 locations? Who had the skills to inflict these specific types of injuries? Who could move between plantations without suspicion? Edmund's name came up. He'd been owned by Preston when Preston died. Owned by Thornton when Thornton died. Owned by Mitchell when Mitchell died. He was a butcher with exactly the skills needed to inflict these injuries. He'd been present at all 3 locations, but the evidence was circumstantial. Nobody had seen Edmund commit any of the murders. He had alibis for all 3. He'd been working, had witnesses who could confirm his presence elsewhere. And the idea that an enslaved man could kill 3 masters over 3 years without anyone noticing seemed impossible. The sheriff brought Edmund in for questioning, asked him directly about the 3 deaths, about his whereabouts, about whether he'd noticed anything suspicious. Edmund answered every question calmly. Expressed horror at what had happened to his 3 masters. Insisted he'd seen nothing, knew nothing, had been as shocked as anyone when the bodies were discovered. The sheriff had no physical evidence linking Edmund to the crimes, no witnesses, nothing but a pattern and suspicion. In 1829, Virginia, you couldn't convict someone, even an enslaved person, on suspicion alone. But the sheriff made a decision. Edmund couldn't be convicted, but he also couldn't be allowed to remain in Louisa County. Too many important men were dead. Too many plantation owners were becoming nervous about their own safety. The sheriff arranged for Edmund to be sold to a slave trader who would take him far away, to the deep south, where he'd be worked to death in cotton or sugar fields, where he couldn't kill any more Virginia masters. Edmund was informed he was being sold. He accepted the news with the same calm obedience he'd shown throughout his interrogation, packed his few belongings, said goodbye to the few people he'd become acquainted with, prepared for the journey south. But Edmund had no intention of working himself to death in a cotton field. He'd killed 3 masters over 3 years. He'd demonstrated exactly what he thought of slavery and the men who perpetuated it. Now he would escape or die trying. The slave trader who purchased Edmund was named Jacob Walsh. Walsh specialized in moving enslaved people from Virginia to the deeper south, where they'd fetch higher prices. He'd assembled a group of 15 people for this trip, including Edmund. The group was chained together at the ankles, enough freedom to walk, not enough to run. Walsh and 2 assistants guarded them with guns and whips. They would travel on foot from Louisa County to Richmond, then by ship to New Orleans, then overland to wherever Walsh could get the best prices. They left Louisa County in early December 1829. The weather was cold, the roads muddy, the journey miserable. Walsh pushed the group hard. He wanted to reach Richmond quickly, get them on a ship before weather made travel impossible. On the third night of the journey, they camped near a creek. Walsh and his assistants set up tents. The enslaved people were chained to trees, given minimal food, left to sleep on the frozen ground. Edmund had been watching the guards, studying their routines. Walsh and one assistant would sleep, while the third kept watch. The guards rotated every few hours. They were armed, but they were also tired from days of travel. Around midnight, when the weakest guard was on duty, Edmund made his move. The chains limited his movement, but Edmund had strong hands and decades of experience working with restraints. He'd butchered thousands of animals that needed to be secured before processing. He worked the bolt holding his chain until he could slip it free. The guard was sitting by the fire, fighting to stay awake. Edmund approached from behind, moving with the same careful silence he'd used approaching Preston, Thornton, and Mitchell. The guard never saw Edmund coming. One precise strike to the back of the head, and the guard dropped. Edmund took the guard's knife, used it to free himself completely from the chains, then freed the other 14 people chained nearby. Walsh and his other assistant were sleeping in tents. Edmund approached Walsh's tent. He could have just run. He was free. He had a knife. He could disappear into the Virginia woods and try to reach free territory. But Edmund had spent 3 years killing masters. He wasn't going to leave Walsh alive. What Edmund did to Walsh was discovered the next morning by local farmers who heard the assistants screaming. The scene was familiar to anyone who'd investigated the deaths of Preston, Thornton, and Mitchell. The same methodical violence, the same surgical precision, the same message about what happened to men who treated humans as property. Edmund and the 14 freed enslaved people scattered into the woods. Most were recaptured within days. They had no resources, no knowledge of the area, nowhere to go. But Edmund was never found. There were reported sightings over the next years. A butcher matching Edmund's description working in Philadelphia. A free black man in Canada who told stories about killing 4 masters in Virginia. Rumors of an underground railroad conductor who was particularly effective at helping people escape and who had extensive scars on his hands from years of butcher work. Whether any of those sightings were actually Edmund is impossible to verify. What we know for certain is that after December 1829, Edmund disappeared from all official records. He was never captured, never prosecuted for the murders everyone believed he'd committed. The story of Edmund the Butcher spread across Virginia and beyond. Plantation owners became paranoid about their skilled workers, particularly those with knowledge that could be weaponized. Some stopped using enslaved people as butchers, afraid of creating another Edmund. The enslaved community told Edmund's story differently. To them, Edmund was a hero who'd struck back against 4 men who represented everything terrible about slavery. He'd used his skills as a butcher, skills that masters valued, to destroy the masters themselves. And he'd escaped, living free somewhere, proof that resistance was possible. Songs emerged in the quarters. Edmund the Butcher. He knew his trade, cut the masters down with his blade. 4 men fell before he ran. Now he's free, a liberated man. The authorities tried to suppress the stories, afraid they'd inspire other enslaved people to violence. But stories like Edmund's couldn't be suppressed. They spread through whispers and songs, through coded messages and careful conversations, becoming part of the oral tradition of resistance. Historians have debated Edmund's legacy. Some argue he was a serial murderer whose actions can't be justified regardless of circumstances. Others argue he was a resistance fighter, targeting the men who'd enslaved him, using violence as the only language the system understood. What's clear is that Edmund demonstrated remarkable sophistication. Over 3 years, he killed 3 masters, using methods that were similar enough to show a pattern, but different enough in execution that nobody connected them until too late. He used his professional skills as a butcher to send a message about what he thought of men who treated people as livestock. And he escaped, disappearing into freedom while leaving behind a legend that terrified slave owners and inspired enslaved people. The violence Edmund committed was extreme. The methods he used were brutal. But context matters. Edmund had spent 33 years as property, had watched his mother, sister, and wife sold away, had been owned by men who treated him as less than human, despite knowing he was intelligent, skilled, capable of sophisticated work. Preston had sold Edmund's mother when he was a child. Thornton had whipped a boy for stealing apples. Mitchell had tortured a woman for trying to escape. Walsh made his living destroying families by moving people in chains from Virginia to the Deep South. Edmund killed all 4 of them using the same skills they'd valued when those skills were applied to animals. He showed them that the butcher they'd trusted to process livestock could process human masters just as efficiently. Was it justice, revenge, terrorism, resistance? The answer probably depends on whether you believe enslaved people had the right to fight back against their oppressors using any means available, even means that involved calculated, methodical violence. Edmund believed they did. He acted on that belief with remarkable effectiveness, and when he had the chance to escape, he disappeared into freedom, leaving behind a story that slave owners wanted forgotten and enslaved people wanted remembered. Today, there's no marker for Edmund, no gravesite, no monument, no official acknowledgement. The places where Preston, Thornton, and Mitchell died have been built over or forgotten. The creek where Walsh was killed has no plaque. But in the oral histories passed down through black families in Virginia, Edmund is remembered. The butcher who became something more than a butcher. The man who used the master's tools to destroy the masters. The killer who escaped and lived free. His story matters because it shows resistance in its most uncompromising form. Edmund didn't petition for freedom, didn't wait for abolition, didn't hope for masters to develop consciences. He took freedom through violence, systematically destroying the men who'd enslaved him, then disappearing before anyone could stop him. The story of Edmund the Butcher is uncomfortable because it doesn't fit neat moral categories. He killed at least 4 people, probably more if the stories about Walsh's guards are accurate. He caused tremendous suffering. He showed no remorse for what he'd done. But he did it to people who owned human beings, who'd built their wealth on slavery, who'd maintained their power through violence and fear, who'd treated Edmund as property for 33 years, despite knowing he was fully human. So was he a hero or a monster? A freedom fighter or a murderer? Someone to celebrate or someone to condemn? Maybe he was all of those things at once. Maybe moral clarity is impossible when evaluating actions taken within the most immoral system America ever created. Maybe the most honest thing we can do is acknowledge the full, complicated truth. Edmund killed people who enslaved him, used sophisticated planning and remarkable skill to do it, and escaped into freedom while leaving behind a legend that both terrified and inspired. Remember Edmund. Remember that he spent 33 years learning the skills masters valued, then used those skills to destroy the masters themselves. Remember that he killed methodically, carefully, effectively sending a message about what happens when you treat people as livestock. Remember that he escaped, that after killing 4 men who'd enslaved or traded him, he disappeared into freedom and was never captured. That somewhere, possibly in Canada or the northern states, Edmund may have lived out his years as a free man, carrying the secret of what he'd done in Virginia. Remember that slave owners across the South became afraid of their butchers after Edmund's story spread. That they looked differently at skilled workers who had knowledge that could be weaponized. That for a brief moment, the people who'd felt completely secure in their power understood they were vulnerable. That's Edmund's legacy. Not just the deaths he caused, but the fear he inspired. The proof that enslaved people weren't helpless, weren't passive, weren't incapable of sophisticated resistance. The demonstration that the tools of slavery could be turned against slave owners by someone patient enough, skilled enough, and angry enough to use them. The butcher who carved up his masters, not because he was insane or evil, but because he'd spent 33 years being treated as property and decided that the men who owned him would pay for that treatment with their lives. Remember that. All of it. The violence and the resistance. The brutality and the escape. The 4 dead men and the legend that lived on after Edmund disappeared. Because forgetting would mean accepting the fiction that enslaved people accepted their condition. Forgetting would mean denying the rage that built over decades of oppression. Forgetting would mean erasing one of the most uncompromising acts of resistance in American slavery. Edmund fought back. He did it with the skills they'd taught him, the tools they'd given him, the knowledge they'd valued when it was used for their benefit. And then he escaped, leaving behind a trail of bodies and a story that couldn't be suppressed, no matter how hard the authorities tried. That's the story of Edmund the Butcher. Not simple, not comfortable, not easily categorized as right or wrong, but true and worth remembering. Was Edmund a justified resistance fighter or a ruthless killer? His 3-year campaign against his enslavers was calculated, brutal, and deliberate, violence born from 33 years of enslavement. Were his former masters victims or oppressors who met the consequences of their own cruelty? Edmund's story defies simple judgment. At History in Chains, we explore stories that challenge moral comfort and reveal the complexities of resistance. Edmund the Butcher used his master's tools to destroy his masters, hero, villain, or something in between. You decide. Subscribe for more untold stories that confront the hard truths of history.